Good afternoon, everyone. Uh, I'm Marc Plattner, the co-editor of the Journal of Democracy and Vice President for Research and Studies here at the National Endowment for Democracy. And on behalf of NED's International Forum for Democratic Studies, I'm very pleased to welcome you all to today's presentation, The Rise and Fall of Constitutionalism in Hungary, featuring Reagan-Fissell Democracy Fellow Gábor Halmai. We're delighted to have with us as a discussant Chris Walker, on my left, who's Executive Director of the International Forum for Democratic Studies. The Reagan-Fissell Democracy Fellows Program hosts some of the world's leading democracy activists, scholars, and journalists, enabling them to conduct independent research and pursue other projects here at NED. Now in its 13th year, the program has brought to Washington more than 200 fellows from over 80 countries since its inception in 2001. Our speaker today, Gábor Halmai, is one of the most distinguished scholars whom we have had the privilege of hosting during all these years. A quarter century ago, at the time of the revolutions of 1989, Hungary was widely regarded as the post-communist country that had the best chance of building a durable democracy. It produced an interim constitution guaranteeing fundamental rights to its citizens, as well as institutional checks and balances. And during the 1990s, its new constitutional court was in the vanguard of bringing independent judicial review to the region. More recently, however, Hungary has come to be viewed by most observers as a democratic laggard. After the conservative nationalist party Fidesz gained a two-thirds majority in the 2010 parliamentary elections, it enacted a new constitution that is regarded as having weakened protection of individual rights and diminished the power of the Constitutional Court and of other countervailing institutions. In his presentation today, Gábor Halmai will seek to analyze and explain the backsliding of liberal democracy in Hungary, drawing lessons to be learned from recent developments there, and offering thoughts on the future democratic prospects of both Hungary and other countries in the region. Gábor Halmai is professor of law at, and I was going to ask you beforehand how to pronounce the name of your university. Eötvös Loránd University in Budapest, where he teaches courses on international human rights and comparative constitutional law. A visiting research scholar at Princeton since 2011, he is the founding director of the Hungarian Human Rights Information and Documentation Center and editor-in-chief of its human rights quarterly called Fundamentum. He's also been national director of the European Master's Program in Human Rights and Democratization in Venice since 2003. Over the course of his distinguished career, he's served as a board member of the EU Fundamental Rights Agency from 2007 to 2010, vice chair of the Hungarian National Election Commission from 2006 to 2010, and perhaps most important for today's presentation, chief counselor to the president of the Hungarian Constitutional Court from 1990 to 97 during its formative years. He's the author of many books and articles on constitutional law and human rights, including, I think it's the most recent, published in 2014, Perspectives on Global Constitutionalism, the Use of Foreign and International Law by Domestic Courts. Chris Walker is Executive Director of the National Endowment for Democracy's International Forum for Democratic Studies, a center for analysis and discussion of the theory and practice of democratic development. The International Forum pursues its goals through several interrelated initiatives: publishing the Journal of Democracy, hosting fellowship programs for international democracy activists, journalists, and scholars, coordinating the network of democracy research institutes, a global network of think tanks, and organizing a diverse range of research initiatives and conferences to explore critical themes relating to democratic development. Prior to joining NED in 2012, Chris was Vice President for Strategy and Analysis at Freedom House in New York, and also served as an adjunct professor of international affairs at NYU. His articles have appeared in the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, the Washington Post, foreignpolicy.com, Barron's, Far Eastern Economic Review, the Moscow Times, Politico.com, the Journal of Democracy, and World Affairs. We'll now turn the floor over to Gábor, who will speak for approximately 25 minutes, followed by Chris's comments for about 10 minutes. Those of you on Twitter can follow this presentation and contribute to the conversation by using the hashtag NEDEvents or by following the forum at Think Democracy and the endowment at NEDemocracy. If you've not already done so, let me ask you to join me in silencing your cell phones. And finally, let me take this opportunity to thank the many staff members here involved in organizing this event, and most especially Research Associate Sarah Amin, who has offered vital assistance to Gábor's fellowship project and to its presentation today. Gábor, the podium is yours.
Thank you very much, Mark. And I would like to start by thanking NED providing me this excellent opportunity of this fellowship to analyze and understand what happened in the last 25 years in my home country, especially regarding its constitutional development, and especially both changes to liberal democracy and to an illiberal democracy, in my point of view. This story, which gives me not only an academic and professional topic, but also a kind of personal issue. And as Mark has mentioned, I served at the Constitutional Court in the very beginning of its practice, and was able to contribute to the first part of the story to build up a kind of rule of law revolution. So therefore, it's a big challenge to me to really explain how this country, which, as again Mark mentioned, had the best chances, probably among all the East European countries in the very beginning, to build up a true liberal democracy, backslided in the last years. So what was the very reason of that backsliding? This is the topic of my presentation. And before I start the presentation, let me also thank not only NED in general, but personally to Carl, to Mark, to Chris, to Sally, and I would like also to mention in the back row, Sarah, who was really very instrumental to help me on fields which are out of my competence. For instance, investigating world surveys about commitment to constitutional values and stuff like that. I'm really not an expert of. So thank you, Sarah, for helping me. So before I start, let me make sure the very definition I'm talking about, liberal democracy and illiberal democracy. Under liberal democracy, as a constitutional scholar, I mean a constitutional system which provides a state governed by the rule of law, meaning checks and balances and guaranteed fundamental rights. Illiberal democracy is the opposite of that, not guaranteeing checks and balances and not providing at least instrumental guarantees for fundamental rights. So as I already pointed out, my presentation won't be a very objective one. So therefore, by starting, I would like to characterize the changes since 2010 with the own words of Prime Minister or Prime Minister candidate Viktor Orbán. To be as objective as possible, if you see the first quotation, which was a speech before the election in 2010, there are many interpretations of that sentence. Some days ago, one Hungarian analyst compared this kind of approach, which is described here, similar to Max Weber's Führerdemokratie, which was written by Max Weber in 1919 in the famous article of him about politics als Beruf. So in that sense, this is an approach of a political system where a kind of unity without diversity is preferred over diversity and unity. One can also interpret that as a kind of lack of pluralism in the political system. The second quotation, which is an interview after the enactment of the new constitution in 2011, Prime Minister Orbán tried to explain that the very aim of the constitutional fathers of Fidesz, the ruling party, wasn't a liberal constitution. He's very frank about it, that despite all the failures of liberal democratic constitutions, the Hungarian government, with its two-thirds majority, constitution-making majority, aimed at a different type of constitution. The question concerning this later quotation is that whether liberalism and democracy must necessarily go hand in hand, or the Hungarian voters have the right to choose not to be liberal and not to enact a liberal constitution. Concerning that question, the second question raises whether this transition from a liberal to an illiberal constitution was really a democratic process. Were the voters, the population, asked about the very content of the future constitution in 2011? And the third question regarding this change of the type of constitution, whether this is in compliance with those values enumerated in Article 2 of the European Union's treaty, namely governing by rule of law, providing guarantees for fundamental rights, minority rights protection, and so on. So in my presentation, I will go over the first period, the so-called rule of law revolution of '89. Then I would like to shortly characterize the most important elements of the so-called constitutional CounterRevolution in 2011. And then going to the more interesting part of the presentation, probably to try to explain the changes, and followed by the the challenges of the current system, both external and internal challenges, and drawing some conclusions. So very shortly, to characterize the so-called rule of law revolution of 1989, this was a dual kind of transition, because at the same time it was a change of the previous so-called communist type of economic system to a market economy, and also change of the governance system to a more or less German type parliamentary democracy. Timothy Garton Ash, the British historian, once called this type of change as a mixture of revolution in the content and reforms from above, which actually prevailed the continuity of the legal system, but of course has broken its legitimacy. The very reason that this is called as a mixed system, not a real revolution, that there were no legitimate actors who actually agreed upon the very content of this transition. There were Polish-type national roundtable negotiations between the previous communist regime and the new opposition parties. Neither of them were democratically elected. That is why I call this system as a post-sovereign kind of system. And this was actually also the characteristic of the constitution-making process, because the National Roundtable agreed on the very content of a comprehensive amendment to the previous constitution, the communist constitution, and these changes were rubber-stamped by the illegitimate parliament. So as a form, this was an amendment to the old constitution. Later on, it was one of the arguments of Fidesz that the 2011 constitution was needed because we still had a Stalinist constitution. In fact, it was a Stalinist constitution in its title, because the title was the 1949 Hungarian constitution, but its content was totally full-fledged, a liberal democratic constitution with very strong checks and balances, with one of the most powerful constitutional courts in the world, with 4 different types of ombudsperson, and with, of course, independent judiciary. Let's talk about the so-called constitutional counter-revolution. I call this counter-revolution because I consider revolutionary changes when the substance of a political and constitutional system is changed. It was a revolutionary change in '89, but it was equally a revolutionary change in 2011, when the new constitution was enacted. Since, as I said, and I tried to prove, the system of a liberal democratic constitutional order was changed to an illiberal one. This constitutional counter-revolution was preceded by 8 years of political rule of a socialist liberal government, which was, on the one hand, very unsuccessful in economic terms, and it was also partly very corrupt. Many of its leaders were found in various corruption scandals involved. Many of them were not really involved, but were charged by the Fidesz government. But in fact, corruption was one of the characteristics of that 8 years. So the very success of Fidesz in the 2010 parliamentary election, they gained 53% of the votes, and due to the very disproportionate election system, with that 53% of the votes, they gained two-thirds majority of the seats. As I mentioned, the two-thirds majority provides the opportunity to change the constitution without any opposition vote whatsoever. Actually, this happened in April 2011. Fidesz enacted a new constitution without any votes of the opposition parties, actually without even involvement of them in the constitution making procedure. As I said, I characterize this kind of constitution making by Fidesz in 2011 procedurally non-revolutionary, since it was a result of the constitution making provisions in the previous constitution. But substantially, as I said, it changed the system from a liberal to an illiberal one. This characteristic of the constitutional regime was even strengthened or made more illiberal due to many constitutional amendments after the constitution in 2011. The most important amendment in that respect was the April 2013 amendment, the Fourth Amendment, which not only put several provisions which were previously annulled by the Constitutional Court into the text of the Constitution, but also annulled all the jurisprudence of the previous Constitutional Court. In September 2013, there were some cosmetic changes made into the Fourth Amendment due to some very harsh criticism of the European institution, especially the Venice Commission of the Council of Europe and the European Parliament. The 2014 elections again repeated almost the same result as it happened in 2010. Although Fidesz got almost 800,000 votes less than in 2010, but due to the change of the electoral system, making it even more disproportionate as it was, with that loss, they got again 45.5% of the votes. And again, due to the change, this 45.5% of the votes was enough for two-thirds majority of the seats. So what are the main characteristics of this illiberal type of constitutional systems? As I mentioned, there are no checks and balances whatsoever in the constitutional system. All the main constitutional positions are in the hands of a very, very narrow circle of people. Actually, they all were in the same year at the law school where I used to teach, by the way, some of them. The Prime Minister, the President of the Republic, the Speaker of the Parliament, and the head of the judiciary were from the same group of law students at the Budapest Law School. All the appointments are either for 9 years or for 12 years, the major, for the major positions, which means they are entrenched for more parliamentary terms. The competences of the Constitutional Court were curtailed. No fiscal cases can be reviewed by the court, and no popular actions are allowed according to the new rules. And as I said, all the previous precedents were annulled by the Fourth Amendment of the Constitution. With some tricks, also the judicial independence was abolished. The main trick was that overnight, by a constitutional amendment, the government reduced the retirement age of the judges from 70 to 62. With that, 10% of the judiciary was changed. And most importantly, most of those judges who were forced to retire were court presidents. So that means that the leadership of the judiciary was changed overnight. A very unique institution was introduced by the new constitution as well, constitutional entrenchment of some political topics. For instance, taxes, the pension system can only be amended with a 2/3 majority, which means that even Fidesz loses its 2/3 majority in the next term, which is very unlikely, but still, if they would, a new government with a simple majority cannot change any provisions of taxes, pension reforms, family system, and so on. As I also pointed out, major guarantees of fundamental rights were abolished. In 2010, even before the Constitution was enacted, a very restrictive media law was enacted with all the controls of the government over not only the public media, but also over the commercial media. More than 300 churches were deregistered by amendment of the Constitution, and a new registration system was introduced in which the parliament itself, with 2/3 majority, decides who can be registered as a church. The new parliament, with its 2/3 majority, instead of the previously 300 churches, registered around 30 new churches. New and old churches, of course. And one more characteristic which is very important, the subject of the Constitution is the Hungarian nation, which means that all those who are not citizens of the country, but are ethnically Hungarians living wherever they live, in the US, in the neighboring countries, they are subject to the Hungarian constitution. But of course, not mentioning that probably those who are Hungarian citizens, but not ethnic Hungarians within the country, not necessarily subject of that constitution. Okay, so let's turn very quickly to the possible explanation. Of course, I cannot provide a final answer to the question I raised. I still try to understand and explain the situation. So here are some possible explanations. One is a historical one, the lack of strong parliamentary democratic traditions in the country, the preferences of strong leader and a strong economy over commitment to democracy. There are certain surveys I already mentioned which can prove this type of explanation as well. Weak civil society was certainly one of the reasons from the very beginning, and still the civil society is very weak in Hungary. The new government does everything in its capacity to do against a strong civil society by introducing several restrictions, taxation and other restrictions for civil society organizations. But frankly speaking, it was from the very beginning a very, very weak civil society. I already mentioned the two constitutional failures, the disproportionate election system, and to that, the very easy amendment possibility of the constitution, which was kept from the previous constitution, which made possible for Fidesz to enact a new constitution. Further explanations. There were most probably no frank consensus among the already mentioned parties at the national roundtable and the opposition roundtable about democratic values. The lack of participatory democracy means that there were no real referendum about either the 89 constitution, neither the 89 nor the 2011 constitution. The rise of populism and extremism, I have several data in a Q&A. I'm happy to share with you those data. I do not have time to only to mention this as well as the slow economic progress and the disappointment of the population, not only before 2010, as I mentioned, but during the entire 25 years of the transition. I really just go through the various points of external challenges. One is the European Union, which in July last year enacted a very harsh critical report about the constitutional situation in Hungary, saying that the democracy is in danger in Hungary. But actually no real consequences followed this majority decision of the European Parliament. Whether it's lack of means of the European Union to really sanction a country which does not comply with the very values of the European Union, or it is the lack of willingness in a political institution like the European Parliament, where conservative parties friendly to the current government are still in majority. It's a question. Also the Council of Europe, even though its institutions, most importantly the Venice Commission, issued very critical decisions and opinions about the state of constitutional development in Hungary, their tools and means are very, very weak to enforce any kind of compliance by the Hungarian constitution. I already mentioned the internal challenges. The Constitutional Court is not only in the lack of competencies I mentioned. The court is already packed. The majority of judges were nominated and elected without any consensus of any opposition parties whatsoever. The majority were nominated and elected exclusively by Fidesz. Also the ordinary courts, as I said earlier, are cannot be considered as independent anymore. So let's turn to the final point, the conclusions. What kind of conclusion can be drawn? So one of the conclusions is obvious. Fidesz was re-elected with almost the same two-thirds majority of the seats, even with the tricks of the election system. But still, this was a major victory in 2014 for Fidesz, despite all of those mentioned developments of the constitutional system. So the question is obvious: is the Hungarian population committed enough to constitutional liberal democracy if they re-elected Fidesz with almost the same majority? The second conclusion I already mentioned also, that the new constitution certainly violates basic principles of the European Union, and it was clearly emphasized by the mentioned and other decisions of the European Parliament. The question is whether there is a willingness, or whether there are means of the European Union to enforce the compliance with those values. And the third conclusion is that whether this kind of backsliding, which was probably the first case after the 1998-90 third wave democratization process, when a committed liberal democracy turned to an illiberal one, whether it will be served as a kind of model for other countries. For instance, countries which face the same economic problems, limited growth in their current situation, will follow the Hungarian path or not. And finally, the final question, which is again beyond my competence, but here at NED, even as a constitutional scholar, I should raise that question: what is then the consequence of that particular backsliding in a particular country, which seeks very, very important economic and also political ties to Russia? Will this somehow strengthen the Russian geopolitical kind of tendency through the Hungarian case? These are questions I cannot give an answer to immediately, but these are certainly very worrying questions, not only for Hungary, but I guess for all Europe and all the transatlantic community. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Gábor, for a presentation that was very comprehensive and both a lot of specific detail, but then raised some very broad questions. And now we'll get some comments on it from Chris Walker. Chris?
Well, thank you, Mark. Thank you also, Gábor, for a very cogent and thought-provoking presentation. I thought I would focus on 3 points, starting first with some regional observations and then work my way down to more specific comments on Hungary. I think one of the features that we see in the new EU member states, including Hungary, has been that after the fall of the Berlin Wall, from a starting point with very weak institutions that were degraded and corroded by decades of the previous system, there was enormous headway made in relative terms and in real terms. So that if you look at the metrics that any number of organizations use to evaluate progress on democratic standards and values, all of these countries, with some exceptions, did very well. As they approached EU membership and NATO membership, and then achieved that in these cases, the performance started to lag, and this was almost uniformly the case across the countries. Again, with rare exceptions. I think if you look today in broad terms, you'll see that Estonia typically is viewed as a country that's managed quite well in political terms and economic terms. Poland, although it's had its ups and downs, genuinely viewed as quite a solid success case. And then you have others that have faced a range of challenges that have gotten at their, raised questions about their ability to mature their democracies. I'd note several of the areas that are features of the challenges, and I think this is true across virtually all of the 8 member states that managed to join before Romania and Bulgaria, and then of course Romania and Bulgaria joined at the end and have their own particular challenges. The first is the relationship between business and politics, which has become trickier and murkier and problematic in most of the countries, and money and politics more generally. This is of course not limited to the new democracies of Central Europe and the Baltic states. It's true for many other countries, including the United States, but it's a feature of the countries in the region. Challenges to the integrity of independent media. It's fundamental. Here, this is both a question of the larger inhospitable nature of economics for the independent media today, which is seen around the world, but it's particularly acute in many of the countries in Central Europe and in the Baltic states. But this is also being propelled by either governments or businesses with a hand in the media industry aligned with the government in a way that really isn't salutary for democratic development. Gábor focused on this properly, the maturity and the independence of the judiciary in the countries in the region. There's been very uneven development of the judicial branch throughout the new EU states for a variety of reasons. Some of this has to do with capacity. Many of the countries have enormous backlogs of cases, which has dreadful impact on the quality of justice, both in the criminal and the civil spheres. And of course, if the judicial capacity isn't developed in a meaningful way, this will jeopardize the rule of law backbone that the judiciary represents. And this is key in so many countries, and it's relevant to other parts of society. And one can argue, I think, credibly, that to the extent the judicial branch doesn't show progress, it creates enormous problems for democracy more broadly. Finally, stepping a bit away from the kind of institutional look at some of the challenges to the systems in the region, I'd note one other that isn't typically included here, and I'd put this in the category of the spirit of democratic solidarity, which the region has typically been looked to for, based on its own history and experience. Central Europe and the Baltic states have been particularly sensitive to the need to think about the democratic success of its neighbors and the wider world. This sadly seems to be eroding in many parts of the region, not every part of the region, but recently in the Czech Republic, to use an example close to Hungary, and you have a business-first community which now thinks dramatically differently about how democratic standards and practices should be safeguarded. It's been, I think, a slow erosion. It's nevertheless there. It's not to say that there still isn't a community in the Czech Republic that puts a premium on defending democratic values, but it's an important feature that's changing. And some of the countries, I think, have struggled mightily and continued in a very positive way. Estonia, Poland, again, come to the top of the list in this discussion. But in this discussion, I think Hungary stands out in certain respects, given the relationship and the statements of political leadership in the country connected to Russia. And if you look at the deal that was arranged in January of this year for Hungary's Seoul nuclear plant with Russia, and other money that appears to be coming into the country with a political tinge, it raises real questions about the orientation of the country and the spirit of democratic solidarity, among other things. The second observation I'd make relates more directly to the trajectory of the Hungarian system. And as I noted in my first comments, all of the new EU member states have confronted challenges to their democracy over the last decade, roughly. One of the issues that Gábor alluded to, and I'd pose this as a question, and it's relevant to his overarching argument, I think, is whether in the Hungarian case the bounds have been broached of what we might call accepted democratic practice. Because in all of the countries we're talking about, there are gray lines between the fights and battles that any democratic system will engender, some of which can be very heated and difficult, but nevertheless remain within what reasonable minds might call democratic bounds. And at what point you cross the line and start to breach those boundaries so that other points of view aren't taken into account, that tolerance isn't a feature of the system, a number of the things Gábor mentioned. But I might ask him just to come back to this and talk about what features he thinks are most important in this respect. Another way to say this would be whether, as he describes it, the counter-revolution, as you've characterized it, is now consolidated and effectively irreversible, which to my mind would constitute a step into the illiberal realm rather than the liberal realm. And finally, I'd like to quote from a passage in a draft article that Gábor shared with me before this session that I think was the basis of a good deal of his presentation today, and get his reaction to it. It's very short, I'll read it. It relates to the first point in his conclusion, and he wrote here, "In Hungary there has never been, and there still is no strong normative commitment to democracy on a behavioral and attitudinal level. Therefore, a broad and deep legitimation of constitutional democracy hasn't been achieved. This means that the significant political actors at both the elite and mass levels are not convinced that the liberal democratic regime is the right and appropriate one for the society, better than any other realistic alternative that they can imagine." This raises the question of whether there's an authentic demand within Hungarian society for liberal democracy, and if not, are the current paramount powers in the country simply supplying what the society desires? So I'll leave it there and would be curious for Gábor's response.
Thanks for those comments and the provocative conclusion. I don't know, Gábor, if you want to respond now or wait till after we get questions from the floor.
Chair.
Why don't you make a brief response, particularly to Chris's last question, and then we'll go to the floor, and I'm sure you'll have more opportunity to expand on your response then.
Thank you, Chris, and these are really great questions. And again, I have to emphasize, I do not know the final answer to those questions. I really have different kind of explanations which may contradict to each other as well. So let's start with the first point very briefly about the weak institutional settings and the behavior element as well. Yes, Hungary was a unique case, even among the other East Central European countries, regarding the institutional framework. I guess that institutionally, Hungary was really one of the pioneers of the rule of law regimes, with sometimes even overemphasized checks and balances. For instance, the Constitutional Court had the competence to review every legal norm on the basis of so-called popular action, which meant that every citizen, even foreigners, could challenge any legal norm against the new constitutional system. So this was a very powerful tool, constitutionally at least. And the first Constitutional Court really was very active to do this job, to filter the entire legal system according to the new constitutional principles. But as in Hungary, also probably in other countries, the lack of mentioned commitment, real commitment among first of all, the political actors, who after the negotiations, at the first time when they felt that they need some change of the constitutional system in order to entrench their newly gained power, they immediately get rid of the original principles. And let me go back and explain this by emphasizing also the responsibility of a community, which Chris mentioned, the European community, which somehow admitted those countries, those 8, and then the 2, and finally Croatia, with a kind of not full-fledged liberal democratic institutional framework. As you may know, the so-called Copenhagen criteria provides a tool for checking the readiness of the candidate states, but there are no tools to check those compliance after the given country was already admitted to the EU. So it's still the case that the EU has no means to not only to kick out a country which certainly does not comply, but not even seriously sanction a country. So Hungary, as I mentioned, was many times harshly criticized by European institutions, but actually nothing happened. So the government was really not threatened by any kind of, not even by financial sanctions. So let me turn to the harshest point of your question. So and Sarah can prove this, that I'm still struggling with two different explanations. One is about the commitment. One is an explanation given by some really very well-known and well-respected political scientists, Ronald Inglehart, Christian Welzel, who designed a kind of explanation for countries with different cultural backgrounds. Their explanation goes like saying that those countries with a strong industrial history are more committed to solidarity, to autonomy, to freedom, to other kind of positive liberal democratic values. And there are some surveys they provide in their 2010 article that Hungary belongs to those countries which do not have this developed industrial history, but are rather agrarian countries which prefer to more authority, to more closeness, to more lack of diversity and other not liberal values. So those kind of explanation may be very, very attractive, but for me it's always a little bit questioning whether we can blame the population for those changes, even though, as I mentioned, the Hungarian population voted for almost with the same majority for that party which turned the liberal democracy to an illiberal one. There is another explanation. One of those political scientists, namely Christian Welzel, in his book published last year, I won't find the name. Anyhow, Raising Freedom, probably. This is the title. So in that book, Welzel tries to explain how the economic situation in a country determines such kind of preferences like liberal democratic values. And I tend to agree with this explanation as well. As I mentioned in my presentation, since 1989, actually, there are continuous economic crises in Hungary. The pursuit of the Hungarian population from the very beginning of the transition was always to reach Austria, the previous partner in the Austro-Hungarian monarchy, to reach the living standard of the Austrians next to the border in Vienna. I have some statistics here. In 1990, the per capita GDP was $10,000 more in Austria than in Hungary. In 2012, it was more than 20,000 US dollars more in Austria than Hungary. So actually the Hungarian population did not achieve that basic goal. And this might be, together with the first explanation, a kind of reason for that backsliding. But again, I do not know the final reasons.
Thank you. Why don't we open it now to questions from the floor? Please identify yourself and your institutional affiliation at the beginning, and we have microphones that we'll bring to you. One over here.
Thank you. We are from Vietnam. Thank you. And I came just 3 months ago. And firstly, I apologize for my English because I improved just for 3 months.
Yes, Dr. Wu is also a constitutional scholar, so we're very pleased he can be here today.
And anyway, I am really interested in your presentation because Hungary is a former communist country, and Vietnam, our country, stay communist. But for now, I must foresee already the situation of post-communism in Vietnam. First question is that I would like you describe more clearly party Fidesz. I don't understand very much. Yeah, what does it mean, Fidesz? Which components does Fidesz consist of? Does include former communist or former Stalinist? I don't know. And because you talk about corrupt governments since 1989, okay, until 2011. And then I wonder if the victories of Fidesz in the election has been a victory, has been a reaction, yeah, to corruption situation in Hungary. And third question, it seems to me that Hungary now about 10 million people. Yeah, that's just for me. That look like a family. A family, because in family there is always a domination of parents, of father, and the relation between Hungarian as a father and children, and maybe that explains the current situation. Yeah, people like partnership. People, excuse me, like father's domination, and everyone in Hungary maybe let the situation go. Yeah. Anyway, I will have other question, but so long already. Thank you.
All right. Maybe we'll take a few more if there are any. Kathy, and then the gentleman behind her.
Kathy Cosman, U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom. I had a question about when you discuss the new liberal constitution, you say that there's the question of the definition of the Hungarian nation that includes the diaspora, but may also exclude certain minorities living within Hungary. And I'm wondering whether this also connects to what I think one could also call a sort of a majoritarian impulse in many post-communist countries, unfortunately led by Russia. I think one could make that case. Thank you.
And gentleman here.
Herbert Regenbogen, Professor of International Relations, International Law, Çağ University, Turkey. I have three questions, briefly. One, the neo-nationalistic integration of Hungary into the EU supersedes that the norms of that country is bounded by the interpretations of those international courts or the European courts. And retroactively, any inactivity of politicians to proceed in enacting any injustices by the politicians of Hungary will meet by rule of law a necessary change in their legislation and in their constitution. Secondly, and that's a question, and the second one is the comparisons of Turkey, Russia, and many other countries like Hungary who are pursuing majoritarian rule of law. How are they being impacted by the international courts of human rights? And the last one is the United States and its constitutional prerogative under civil law called ACTA, Alien Claims Tort Act, that would also give venue to federal courts in this country for any injustices under civil law, abuses. that could not be pursued in the jurisdiction of Hungary.
Thank you. Gábor, do you want to
Yes.
respond to those?
So thank you very much for the very interesting questions. Dr. Wu, describing Fidesz would need another presentation. It's a very interesting phenomenon. Fidesz is for young Democrats. When the party was established in 1988, there was even an age limit for members. That time it was 30. So no one above 30 could be possibly member of Fidesz. Later it has changed since Prime Minister Orbán is just reached 50. But anyway, it was a really young democratic party with a very strong liberal agenda. It was a liberal party, member of the Liberal International in Europe. Actually, this has changed already before the second democratic election in 1994, when Fidesz realized that the previous governing party, the conservative Hungarian Democratic Forum, which won the first democratic elections in 1990, actually collapsed. They disappeared. They remained in the next parliament with very few votes. And Fidesz realized that there is a gap in the middle right of the Hungarian political spectrum, while in the liberal part of the spectrum, there was a very strong liberal party, the Alliance of Free Democrats, which was a coalition partner to the Socialist Party, the previous Communist Party until 2009. So since Fidesz realized that there is no place on that liberal side of the spectrum, they just went over to the other side, becoming a committed middle right party with a strong Christian characteristic. Previously, Fidesz was very much anti-religious party. They were even very militant anti-religious. When the Pope in 1991 visited Hungary, Fidesz was strongly against the visit of the Pope in Hungary. Nowadays, Fidesz is a Christian democratic party, considers themselves as a middle right party. So I would characterize that party as a very pragmatic political institution, which very cleverly used the opportunity to go into that hole in the political spectrum, and actually was successful with that conservative agenda in the 1998 elections when they first came to power. Yes, as I mentioned, the second question, corruption. Corruption was certainly one of the reasons of Fidesz's success in the 2010 elections. I wouldn't say that corruption was characteristic for the entire 20 years of the transition, but it was certainly characteristic in the very last years of the socialist liberal government, especially from 2006 onwards. I wouldn't say that this was the only reason of Fidesz's success, but certainly one of the reasons. About the family of 10 million people, there are some data that Hungarians tend to tend to like strong leaders, as I already mentioned. And I also think, as I tried to explain in my first reaction to Chris's question, that this is somehow a kind of consequence of the economic situation. By the way, there are much larger families in this world, and there were much larger families in this world which very much liked kind of father figures of dictators. So it's not a privilege of small family countries. Concerning the very interesting legal questions, I appreciate your questions. The first one, what are the consequences of all the international involvement and criticism and decisions of the European Union and so on? You may know that in very, very important cases, for instance, in the already mentioned retirement age of the judges' cases, the European Court of Justice ruled that this violates the European law. But actually, nothing really happened. Hungary was forced to change that law, but by that time, Hungary changed the law, providing some compensation for those retired judges. All of the positions, judges' positions, were already filled. And of course, the European Court of Justice had to acknowledge also that you cannot fire the newly appointed judges, because then you repeat the illegality of the act which was committed at the first place by the government. So the very intention of the government with beheading the judiciary was fulfilled, despite decisions of the European Court of Justice. Or, as you mentioned, the European Court of Human Rights. There are several decisions of the European Court of Human Rights. Lastly, the court ruled in the mentioned deregistration of churches that this violates the European Convention on Human Rights. But as you may know, the decisions of the European Court of Human Rights do not apply directly to the Hungarian system. So none of the deregistered churches were registered again due to the decision of the European Court. The Hungarian government has to pay some fines, some €1,000 fines, but so what? Today the Hungarian parliament will again decide not to register some churches which fulfill all the legal requirements being registered church. The US Alien Tort Statute, it's a very, very nice institution introduced in 1789, rarely used since that, and since the last decision of the US Supreme Court in Kiobel last year, unfortunately, I do not see any prospects to use in any cases regarding Hungary or other countries, unfortunately.
Thank you. Other questions? One right here, and to the back, and two more there. We'll take them in order.
Thank you. My name is George Sapari. I'm the ambassador of Hungary. So before, I will have three comments, but let me tell you a little bit about my background. I left Hungary in 1956 and ended up in the United States and lived here in Washington, D.C. for 27 years working for the IMF. And I went back in 1990, so I am there. I've been there ever since the change in regime. And I have a different perspective of the things. So I will only comment on three things. The first one is the speech that Orban made about the center force in Hungary. I happened to be at that speech and participated in the discussions. I think what he had in mind was that with the change in regime, which was, Hungary was the first country that started to discuss a change in regime and go to democracy in 1988 around the round table. On the one hand were the communists, and the other hand the opposition parties. When the change in regime occurred, actually on the left there was the former Communist Party, the Socialist Party, which dominated the media, state companies, the economic situation, and there were the Free Democrats, which were also to the left, but they joined the socialists in the government, even though the socialists won the majority, and Gábor was a member of parliament of that party, the Free Democrats.
No.
And on the right, there were four parties. Some of them, people were just coming out from the underground, from libraries, universities, etc., with no political power, political expertise. And there was Fidesz, who were at that time very young, in their 20s. Then, as Gábor mentioned, the MDF broke up to three different parties. The smallholders broke up to two different parties. And what Orban said is, this country that way is ungovernable. You have to have a central force, a center right, he said, a force that can govern the country. And he set out to put together the center right parties into one party. And he succeeded in that. So that's my first point. Second point, that Gábor said that the new election system is disproportionate. I mean, it's much more proportionate than it was before. It satisfies the Venice Commission's recommendation that no district can deviate more than 50% from the average, 20% in exceptional cases. That happened. Before that, the district sometimes had a population to 1 to 3 times bigger. And it is true that there were 800,000 less voting for Fidesz, but that was because the participation rate declined. Why did it decline? Maybe because there was no alternative to vote for. And here's my third point, is that a real checks and balances requires an alternative. And if the left in Hungary would get its act together, and rather than whining in Brussels and Washington, had an alternative message that the population would vote for, they have as good a chance to win elections in Hungary. Finally, the European Parliament, Fidesz is member of the family of the People's Party, which is a central party. The head of that party, in the European Parliament, came to Hungary and campaigned for Fidesz. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Gentleman in the back. Oh, it's Marara. Hello.
I am from Ethiopia, and we also call our country a former communist or a former socialist country. I think my reading of East Europeans is that probably where the promise of liberal democracy has failed or failing, people would react. Probably for parties that can take care of their livelihoods and so on and so forth. I think it probably now it is a reaction to the failure of liberal democracy in Eastern Europe, and probably that's what is affecting to just my whatever reading I have about Eastern Europe. My question is the problem of defining democracy. If Hungarians are voting in a democratic game for whatever party, how you are calling it illiberal democracy because the majority of Hungarians voted for it. Are you saying the democratic game in Hungary, probably the votes in Hungary are fraud, not the electoral commissions and others as we have in Africa are not neutral and independent. How elections in Hungary are taking place? If the elections are free and fair, then whomever is elected to the office should be considered at least whatever came to power through a democratic means. So what I want to know is how you are conducting elections, and if a majority of people voted for whatever party, including the Communist Party of anywhere, how you can call it, it is not what we call democracy.
Thank you. Our time is running short, so I could ask Art and Susan there to be brief. Thank you.
Yes, Art Kaufman, World Movement for Democracy. So my question, in whatever time might be remaining, is really to look forward to the future. What do you see as being the possibility of yet another, I suppose, reform movement? Is there an emerging leadership for that? Or do you think there'll be some sort of slow evolutionary process of moving towards more liberal democracy? Thank you.
Susan Alberts, independent writer. Sort of following up on what you said, I am curious if you could say a few words about what is the extent or nature or possibilities of pushback from civil society?
Okay. Another interesting set of questions. I think a lot of them revolve around the relationship between liberalism and democracy, which is a deep question, but why don't you try to have a go at it?
To Ambassador Sapari, whom I really admire his work on behalf of Hungary. So the first question, the center force as a feature to a reaction to what happened in the 90s. Actually, it wasn't a reaction to the 90s. It was a reaction in 2009. So it wasn't the lack of any possible forces on the right. Fidesz was already occupying the right in 2009. So I do not understand the relationship between the 94 situation I explained. Fidesz occupied the space, the empty space on the middle right. By the way, I've never been a member of the Liberal Party, but it's my personal problem. So, but yes, I supported very much the that time Liberal Party and its kind of agenda, but I don't think that this vision of Orbán from 2004 can be characterized as a kind of realistic approach to a given situation. No, this is a pursuit of an authoritarian system, a one-party system, even with probably many parties in the parliament. We know that in China there are more than 10 parties. So, but it's still a one-party system. I do not claim that Hungary reached that situation. I don't think that Hungary is an authoritarian system now. It certainly is. Freedom House just put to the margin of semi-consolidated democracy. I would be more critical putting already Hungary into the hybrid regimes. But still, this pursuit of Fidesz was certainly an authoritarian regime, in my view. But this is my personal opinion. They could not reach that point yet, fortunately. The second question about the election system, and this is response to Moreira's second question about the election system. The Hungarian election system is certainly more disproportionate than the previous one. It is very easy to prove that, since the proportion of the individual constituencies has been raised to the proportion of the party list. This is clear. Responding to Moreira's substantive question about the democratic characteristic of the last election law, yes, it was a semi-democratic election. Certainly, Fidesz would have reached the majority without changing the election system. But the change of the election system certainly resulted the two-thirds majority. At least, this is fact, 6 mandate of Fidesz was due to a newly introduced and very unique system of compensating the winners. This is a new invention in democratic systems, that the new system compensates the winners. 6 votes were provided to Fidesz due to this winner compensation, and Fidesz's two-thirds majority is with 1 vote. So it's clear that this election changes, not to speak about any other changes, possible gerrymandering, more disproportionate system involving the outside Hungarians not living in Hungary and voting 95.5% for Fidesz from Romania, Slovakia, and other neighboring countries. 95.5%. This is probably even more than the previous Vietnamese result of an election. They were provided Hungarian citizenship, and with that Hungarian citizenship also voting rights, not even willing to live in the country, just voting via mail. By the way, those living in the US, as myself and my colleagues, probably Ambassador Sapari as well, were not provided the possibility to vote via mail. We had to go to the embassy or the consulate. Okay, the more important questions whether, and this is Ambassador Sapari's second question and the last 2 questions about the alternative. Frankly speaking, I do not see real alternatives in the current political situation in Hungary. The left is very much divided. The liberal parties, the previous big liberal party to the young, small Fidesz disappeared, totally disappeared from the parliament, the Alliance of Free Democrats. And the left is divided to 3 different fractions. And even these leftist parties do not provide a real liberal democratic approach. For instance, according to a survey just published yesterday, anti-Semitism within the leftist parties is the same as anti-Semitism in Fidesz, very high. Around 30% of the voters are anti-Semitic regarding to certain questions. Of course, we have a real Nazi party which is even more anti-Semitic, but it's not a good news for those who are willing to have some really liberal approach. So, and yes, to Ambassador Sapari's third questions, yes, EPP is very much defending Fidesz. This is the very problem of the European Union nowadays, that this is very much a party politics and not the principles. So the CDU from Germany should protect the very values of the second article of the European Treaty, and not the party members from Hungary and the same with the socialists who are protecting their party members from Romania. So this is not a value-based system, unfortunately. And finally, and this is probably a crucial question here at NED, this is Moreira's substantive question about what is then democracy, and whether we can claim that a country is an illiberal democracy despite the voters voted for that government. Yes, this is an illiberal democracy. It may be an electoral democracy. Maybe the elections were not fraud, and I do not claim that they were. I do claim that the election rules were designed, and this is not my observation. OSCE said that the election rules serve the governing party. This was a very harsh criticism from the OSCE observers of the April elections 2014. I would say that this is still an electoral democracy, but certainly not a liberal democracy, as I defined in my introducing words, saying that this is not providing checks and balances and not providing guaranteed fundamental rights. Thank you.
Thank you. Chris, did you want to?
Just very briefly, first I'd like to apologize to Croatia, because I think I overlooked them in my list of new EU member states, and Gábor reminded me. I think regionally, one of the larger questions is both the challenges that the new EU member states are facing, but also Southern Europe more generally. So there's a wide swath of terrain, including some of the longer-standing EU members to the south, that are confronting enormous problems, and this is a larger issue. I think the question of whether elections make democracy, clearly dominant powers have some responsibility to ensure they don't entrench anti-democratic practices. I think the debate now, and Gábor has very eloquently laid out his arguments, is whether the steps that have a majoritarian character are going to be exclusionary and irreversible. In many ways, that seems to be the heart of the matter. And I think if Gábor's most critical interpretation of events prove true over time, this will have very serious implications both for Hungary, of course, but also for young democracies in the region.
And let me just close in response to Moreira's question by quoting a sentence from an article in the very first issue of Journal of Democracy 25 years ago by Leszek Kolakowski, who said, no one would call a society democratic in which 51% of the population could vote to put to death the remaining 49%. Maybe one technically could say no one could call such a society liberal, but I think the point is clear that what we commonly mean by democracy is not exhausted by what a majority is willing to vote for. In any case, let me thank Gábor for a wonderful presentation, Chris for his very good comments, and all of you for staying over time and so on. It's remarkable in Washington.
That's right.
Despite the game, yes. So thank you.